Hi, I'm Chris Green, the History Chap, telling the forgotten stories from British history. Most people know the Duke of Wellington for defeating Napoleon at Waterloo. But when asked which was the hardest battle he'd ever fought, Wellington didn't name Waterloo. Without hesitation, he claimed that it was the Battle of Assaye. Fought in India in 1803, it was his first major command and his most daring gamble. Against overwhelming odds, a young Arthur Wellesley led just 6,000 men against a Maratha army 7 times its size. This is the gripping story of how Britain's greatest general forged his legacy, not in Europe, but in the heart of India. To understand Assaye, we must first understand the India of 1800. It wasn't a single nation, but a patchwork of kingdoms, rival rulers and empires in decline. And into this mix, we need to add the British East India Company. For the previous 40 years, it had started to move from a mere trading company to an imperial ruler in its own right. Gaining control of Bengal, Madras and Bombay, the company was slowly tightening its grip on the subcontinent. But the company's further expansion was checked by the Maratha Confederacy. The Confederacy was a loose alliance of powerful regional rulers, technically loyal to a single figure, the Peshwa in the city of Poona. In reality, however, each Maratha state pursued its own ambitions. At its height, the Confederacy controlled swathes of India and had even made the Mughal emperor a figurehead under their protection. And they defeated the British before during the First Anglo-Maratha War in the 1770s. But by the turn of the 19th century, the Confederacy was in disarray. Young and inexperienced rulers, blood feuds and bitter rivalries between the houses of Holkar, Scindia and the Peshwa himself had fragmented this alliance. The death of the Peshwa's chief minister in 1800, a statesman who'd held the alliance together, triggered a spiral of internal conflict. In April 1802, the Peshwa's feud with Holkar boiled over. Following his capture in battle, the ruler of Holkar was, on the Peshwa's orders, flogged 200 times and dragged to death chained to the leg of an elephant. The dead ruler's half-brother, Jaswant Rao, now raised an army to extract revenge. He crushed the Peshwa's forces and seized Puna. About to be deposed, the Peshwa, Baji Rao, appealed to the only power who could check his adversary, the East India Company. And that was just what the new Governor-General of Bengal had been waiting for. His name? Richard Wellesley. Richard Wellesley was the older brother of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. As the eldest son, he had inherited the title of Earl of Mornington upon the death of his father, and was appointed Governor-General of Bengal in 1797. His arrival in Calcutta would mark a step change in Britain's ambitions in India. He saw British control of India not just as an imperial ambition in itself, but part of a wider world conflict with revolutionary France. Napoleon Bonaparte's arrival in Egypt the year after Wellesley had become Governor-General reinforced that belief. And don't forget, the British and the French East India Companies had vied for power and fought each other in India through the 1700s. And whilst it was the British who'd come out on top, the French still had ambitions on the subcontinent. Many local rulers employed French officers to arm and train their troops to European standards. Not least the Marathas, where Pierre Coulier-Perron and fellow Frenchman Benoit de Boyne held key positions within the army of Scindia. By the way, it wasn't just Frenchmen who were offering their services to the Maratha states. A Hanoverian and former East India Company sergeant, Anthony Pohlmann, was also serving as a colonel in that same army. At a more strategic level, Tipu Sultan, the ruler of the southern state of Mysore, openly supported the French as a way of eliminating the British in India. Whilst in Egypt, Napoleon had even written to Tipu expressing his desire to send a French army to support him. It would have been an interesting what-if had Napoleon Bonaparte himself arrived in India, especially as by now Richard Wellesley had been joined on the subcontinent by his younger brother, Arthur, the future Duke of Wellington. Now that really would have been an interesting historical sliding door moment. But Arthur Wellesley versus Napoleon would not happen for over 10 years. In the meantime, whilst Napoleon was already being lauded as a hero in France, Arthur Wellesley was a military non-entity back in Britain. 9 years Richard's junior and very much in his older brother's shadow, Arthur Wellesley had joined the army in 1787. Initially gazetted as an ensign in the 73rd Regiment of Foot, he purchased his way up the officer ranks, as was the custom at that time in the British Army. He eventually joined the 33rd Regiment of Foot, first as a major, rising to colonel of the regiment. Later on in the 19th century, the 33rd were renamed the Duke of Wellington's regiment. Wellesley and the 33rd were posted to India, arriving in Calcutta in February 1797, some 8 months before Richard arrived as Governor-General. In 1799, Arthur participated in the successful British victory over the pro-French Tipu Sultan. It was the first part of Richard Wellesley's ambitious plan to make Britain the preeminent power in India. But Richard Wellesley, despite increasing the size of the East India Company army from 115,000 to 155,000 men, larger than the entire British army at that time, didn't simply rely on military conquest to expand British rule. Rather like a chess player, he used the military when necessary, but was equally at home using more subtle tactics. And a key tool in his and the company's arsenal was the subsidiary alliance system. It offered rulers military protection in exchange for British control over foreign policy and the installation of a British garrison in their state. Ostensibly an alliance, it was in practice submission. Using this system, he turned Hyderabad into a client state, and Baji Rao's flight gave him the perfect excuse to do the same within the Maratha Confederacy. Whisked away to the safety of Bombay by a British ship, the down-on-his-luck ruler signed a treaty accepting the British as his overlords. In return, they would provide a large garrison close to his palace to return him to power, and probably to ensure he remembered who was his new overlord. Down in Mysore, Colonel Arthur Wellesley was preparing for the inevitable military confrontation. Commanding his first army, he paid careful attention to drill, fast marches, robust intelligence, and top-class logistics, all hallmarks of his later campaigns in the Napoleonic Wars. In March 1803, his army was ordered to advance on Poona and restore Peshwa Baji Rao to his throne. Marching 300 miles during the monsoon season because he calculated, correctly as it turned out, that the enemy would try to avoid campaigning in that weather, he entered Puna without a shot being fired. The Holkar army had already withdrawn. That tactical withdrawal by their leader, Jaswant Rao, lulled the British into a false sense of complacency. Richard Wellesley believed that it proved that the much vaunted Marathas were no match for his army. But if the British Governor-General thought that the other Maratha rulers would line up behind Baji Rao to sign over their independence to the East India Company, he was very much mistaken. And whilst the houses of Holkar and Scindia were loath to put aside their own differences, they were both willing to take on the British. On the 1st of August 1803, Daulat Rao of Scindia declared war on the British. Whilst one British army under General Lake advanced from Bengal in the north towards Delhi, Arthur Wellesley, now Major General, advanced from the south, breaking camp on the 6th of August. On the 23rd of September, Wellesley's scouts informed him that Scindia's army was camped near the village of Assaye. It was a formidable force, upwards of 40,000 men, including cavalry, European drilled infantry, and over 100 artillery pieces, some of which were served by highly trained gunners under French or European officers, like Colonel Pullman, who we mentioned earlier. The position they occupied was strong too, between the Katna and Juar rivers, with the front protected by the steep riverbanks and the flanks by water. The Maratha right was heavy with cavalry, over 30,000. The left, closer to the village of Assaye, was lined with the infantry, trained in European tactics. The guns were spaced along a mile-long front. To take on an army of 40,000 men and 100 cannon, Wellesley had just 6,500 men and 20 guns. Apart from the 74th and 78th Highland Regiments and the 19th Light Dragoons, the majority of his army were Indians from the Madras Army. They comprised the 4th, 5th and 7th Madras Native Cavalry and the 2nd, 4th, 8th, 10th and 12th Madras Native Infantry. The 74th and 78th Highlanders became part of the Highland Light Infantry and Seaforth Highlanders respectively, now both within the Royal Regiment of Scotland. The 2nd and 12th Madras Native Infantry now form part of the Punjab Regiment in the modern Pakistani army. Outnumbered 7-1 and facing overwhelming enemy artillery, many commanders would have waited for reinforcements, but not Wellesley. He later wrote, "I considered the defeat of the enemy essential at that moment, and that, if not attacked, he might retire and therefore protract the war." And attack he did. At dawn on the 23rd of September, 1803, Wellesley began his manoeuvre. His infantry waded across the Katna River at a ford beyond the left of the Maratha position, which he had identified because there were villages on both sides of the river. The crossing was more treacherous than expected. The water was waist-deep in places, and men struggled to keep their powder dry. Some lost their footing, whilst others hoisted their Brown Bess muskets above their heads as they waded forward. The artillery proved even more difficult. Only 4 12-pounder guns could be brought across. The rest sank in the mire. The British line formed in 2 ranks. The 74th and 78th Highlanders anchored each flank. Whilst Highland regiments, both had substituted their kilts for cooler white cotton trousers. In the centre stood the 10th Madras Native Infantry, with the 4th and 12th in support. Behind them waited the 19th Light Dragoons and 3 regiments of Madras cavalry. Wellesley had hoped for surprise, but the Marathas were ready. As soon as they identified the threat, they wheeled their entire army, a remarkable manoeuvre for such a vast force, to face the new axis of attack. Wellesley would later write, with admiration, "Their infantry is the best I've seen in India, excepting our own." Then the Maratha batteries opened fire with devastating precision. According to eyewitnesses, the accuracy and speed of the Maratha artillery rivalled that of the French. One officer later remarked, "It was as if the very gates of hell had been flung open." The British advanced under a blistering storm of canister and round shot. The 74th Highlanders took especially severe punishment. Advancing behind a screen of Madras skirmishers, they came under direct fire from the guns stationed near Assaye. Wellesley described the Maratha gunfire against the advancing 74th as the heaviest that had been known in India. Whole ranks fell, and to escape the bombardment, the 74th now veered to the right, creating a dangerous gap in the line. Seizing the opportunity, the Maratha cavalry poured through the breach. The British line was nearly shattered, but Wellesley kept his nerve. He personally led the 19th Light Dragoons and 4th Madras Cavalry in a daring countercharge. They surged through the infantry and crashed into the Maratha horsemen and drove them back through their own lines, disrupting formations and trampling through the gun batteries. Elsewhere, the 78th Highlanders surged forward on the left. In fierce close-quarter fighting, they took battery after battery. But the danger wasn't over. Maratha gunners, trained to feign death, rose after the British had passed and turned their guns to fire into the attackers' rear. The 78th, with support from the 7th Madras Cavalry, wheeled back and fought to retake the positions, this time ensuring no gunners remained alive to try a second time. The carnage was immense. Quartermaster James Grant, seeing every officer of the 74th dead or wounded, left his rear position and helped a Major Swinton rally the survivors. Together, they led what remained of the regiment through to the very end. Their actions would later be commemorated by the 74th annually on Assaye Day. Wellesley himself was in the thick of it. 2 horses were shot from under him. At one point, his orderly, riding at his side, was decapitated by a cannon shot. In a macabre spectacle, the terrified horse now galloped around the battlefield, carrying its headless rider until managing to throw him off. The intensity of the battle, Wellesley later said, surpassed anything he experienced at Waterloo. The enemy's resistance, the power of their guns, the sheer chaos, it pushed him and his men to the brink. After 2 hours of brutal combat, the Maratha line began to collapse. Their European officers fled. The cavalry withdrew, and discipline faltered. By the end, over 6,000 Maratha soldiers were dead, wounded or captured. Wellesley's army had taken nearly 2,000 casualties, killed and wounded, 1 in every 3 men. Of the 500-strong 74th Highlanders, 400 were killed or wounded. Every officer from the regiment was a casualty, 11 of whom were killed. The 74th finally returned to Britain in 1806, having served 17 years in India. They then fought extensively in the Peninsular War under Wellesley. A detachment of the regiment were aboard HMS Birkenhead when it tragically sank in shark-infested waters off South Africa in 1852, and I've told that particular story about HMS Birkenhead in another episode. The East India Company presented all the regiments who fought at the Battle of Assaye with special colours bearing an elephant symbol to honour their part in the bloody victory. Following the heavy losses taken by the British at Assaye, one of his senior officers wrote to his Major General, "I hope you will not have the occasion to purchase any more victories at such a high price." And it had been a huge price. Whilst numerically Wellesley would lose more men at battles like Talavera and Waterloo, those casualties accounted for a quarter of his men on each of those occasions. His casualty rate at Assaye was a third. Yet, outnumbered 7-1 and with minimal artillery, Arthur Wellesley had achieved a near impossible victory. Whilst he'd been in battle before, this was the first battle where he was in total command. And apart from winning the field, he had captured 98 of the 100 Maratha guns. It was an emphatic victory. News of the victory was greeted by Richard Wellesley in Calcutta with elation. Assaye had decisively broken Maratha strength in central India, and shortly afterwards the state of Sindhia sued for peace. Meanwhile, General Lake's campaign in the north, culminating in the capture of Delhi, completed the strategic picture. In December 1803, a peace treaty brought the war to a close. The company gained control of Delhi, Agra, and territory that connected its three presidencies into a single continuous block. With control of Delhi, the Mughal emperor now became a British puppet. Whilst the Marathas were not finished, they would never recover their former strength. The Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1817 to 1819 would be their final undoing. There would be many battles and wars for the British to fight against other princely states, and two bloody wars with the Sikh kingdom of Punjab. But nevertheless, the Battle of Assaye and the defeat of the Marathas can be seen as the moment when the British became the paramount power in India. And the Wellesley brothers, Richard and Arthur, had played a major role in that moment. The victory had other implications too. French influence in the subcontinent was effectively extinguished. And it would be against the French back in Europe that Arthur Wellesley would become a household name and a hero in Britain as the Duke of Wellington. In 1805, Arthur Wellesley returned to Britain with his brother aboard HMS Howe. En route, they stopped at St Helena, where 10 years later, after Wellington's victory at Waterloo, Napoleon would be banished in exile. But that was all in the future. Upon his arrival in London in 1805, and despite his victory against the odds at Assaye, Arthur Wellesley was not yet a household name in Britain. But in military circles, he was already being recognised as a commander of rare talent. In September of that year, whilst waiting to meet the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, he encountered Britain's greatest naval hero, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. Not realising who Wellesley was, Nelson proceeded to deliver a monologue all about himself. It was only after he'd left the room that he inquired whom that young Major General was, and finding out it was the hero of Assaye, he re-entered the room, a transformed man, who proceeded to pound Wellesley with questions and listen to his answers. Wellesley later recalled that it was the most interesting conversation that he'd ever had. They wouldn't have another. Just a few weeks later, Nelson was killed in action at the Battle of Trafalgar. Wellesley, on the other hand, would go on to even greater victories, firstly commanding the ultimately successful Peninsular War, and then defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. It was during the Peninsular War that he became Viscount Wellington, before being made Duke of Wellington in 1814, the year before Waterloo. And it was those battles at Salamanca, Vittoria, Waterloo, for which he is chiefly remembered. But his very first battle, arguably the battle that made him, was far away in India on the 23rd of September, 1803. When later in his career he was asked what his hardest fought battle had been, Wellington didn't hesitate. "Assaye," he said. The Battle of Assaye, Wellington's forgotten victory. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story about Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, and his first victory at the Battle of Assaye in India. If you'd like to support my channel, then please consider becoming a member, a patron, or making a one-off donation. There are links below. I'm Chris Green, the History Chap. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.